What is up, YouTube? Welcome back to another training vlog, and today we are aiming for the last training session of this current training block. It is also the last heavy session of this macro cycle, and as you probably might know, I've been testing a new protocol over the last 12 weeks, and today we're going to test if it actually worked. But I've made a couple of mistakes along the way. Some of them I didn't see coming, but they definitely cost me. So here's a little recap of what I've been doing the last couple of months. And I've been running a 4-day training split based on recovery times per set count. So for example, to recover from 3 sets, it takes about 48 hours. For 4 to 5 sets, it takes 72 hours, and so on. I will display them over here. So the split that I've been running was upper push, lower pull, upper pull, lower push, and then vice versa for the next training session. And I used roughly 6 to 8 sets per training session of exposure per muscle group. And for the lower body, I used primarily the rep range of 6 to 10. As for my upper body lifts, during my primary sessions, I used the rep range of 3 to 5 reps. And for my secondary session, I stick to the 6 to 10 rep range. I used a top and back of set method. For most main lifts, I kept the main lifts submaximal. That means I've trained them at a relatively low intensity, but I've been pushing my accessories pretty close to failure. And the progression across the block was ascending RPEs. So depending on the lift, I either started at an RP 5 and then increased toward an RP 8 until week 4, or I've started an RP 6 and increased an RPE point weekly until I've hit it an RP 9 in the last training week. So what did actually work well? I definitely progressed well in my main lifts. I hit a couple of rep PRs on a block-to-block basis, so the higher rep ranges were definitely working well with the system. Another thing I'm quite happy about are my physique improvements. I definitely feel and look bigger, the muscles are just fuller, and yeah, I definitely gained quite a bit of muscle mass on my quads and on my upper back, so I'm quite happy with the progress during those last 12 weeks. Another thing that I really liked is that training felt super productive and goal-orientated, and yeah, I had a lot of fun training at a relatively high frequency because that's something I've never done before. I always trained at 2 to 3 sessions per muscle group per movement per week, and it was the first time that I trained upper body and lower body movements 4 times per week, and it's worked quite well for me to a certain point. So here is what didn't work. The biggest mistake that I made is that I didn't account for cross volume. So for example, in multi-joint exercises like a squat, it's not just the quads that are contributing to it, it's also the hamstrings and other muscles. So it's not purely an isolation exercise or an exercise where you can isolate certain muscles and count that to a specific muscle group or movement pattern. And the same is true for my upper body movements, right? So whenever I trained pull, I was also recruiting some of those, or especially when I was training vertical pulling patterns, they recruited a lot of pecs and triceps, which I didn't account for, right? So I've trained pull one day and the next day or the day after I already trained push again. So there was definitely not sufficient time in between those 2 sessions for the muscles to recover. And that is definitely something that contributed to me being quite sore starting from week 8, week 9 on. And yeah, my elbows, my hamstrings, they were kind of sore all the time because in the early weeks of the training block, it was not an issue at all because the loads were pretty light. The main lifts were quite far away from failure, so they were sub-max anyway. And fatigue just accumulated over the weeks. I had to make the decision that the frequency was just too high and that I made a mistake in terms of calculating the volume, and that's something I want to account for in my next training plan and ensure that there is less overlap. As I mentioned before, for my upper body lifts, I was sticking to those lower rep ranges, especially for my primary sessions. So I didn't have an issue with progressing the higher rep ranges. It was actually the issue that I had a very hard time to progress those lower rep ranges, because the accumulated fatigue from those higher rep sets induces quite a bit of fatigue, which I had to account for and I need to account for in the future. So takeaway is the frequency was simply too high given the load selection, exercise selection, intensity, and so on. the block is a wrap. We finished squats quite strong, better than expected. When I was walking the bar out of the rack, I wasn't feeling pretty good, to be honest, because the bar felt quite heavy on my back. But that was probably due to overshooting my RDLs yesterday. And then I was really surprised when I squatted the weight and it felt way lighter than expected. And I was going way too deep. So I could have saved some kilos or a couple more reps. Yeah, maybe we'll leave them for the next time. And talking about reps, I miscounted during the set, and to be sure I did another rep. So I came out at 6 reps. It was planned to do 5 reps. Yeah, what can I say? More than happy, and let's continue with the rest. Here is what I'm changing for my next training block. The first thing I'm going to change is that I'm switching to an upper and lower split instead of my previous split, and that helps me reduce the exposures throughout the week, so I have a lower frequency, which should allow for sufficient recovery in between the sessions, while obviously accounting for the set count per session and matching that to recovery times. Another thing that I'm going to change is that I'm reducing the amount of goals. So I'm specializing on 2 lifts only, one for the upper body and one for the lower body. And that really helps me save energy for what is really important during that phase. Because if you divide your energy across several goals, you will have a hard time progressing all at the same rate. And 1 or 2 lifts will always take a beat. And I want to be aware of that and reduce my goals and then cycle those specialization phases throughout the year. So each lift has a designated time of the year where it gets prioritized. Another thing that I'm going to account for is cross volume and joint stress. So I will definitely make smarter decisions when it comes to exercise selection, load selection, and load management throughout a training block and throughout the next couple of training blocks, right? As I mentioned in the beginning, the previous or the initial weeks of the training block felt pretty light. I didn't have any issues, but as the loads increased and average workload increased over the last couple of weeks, I also got more issues in terms of recovery issues and so on, and that's definitely something I want to account for by managing all these factors a bit better. So in summary, we can say that I'm going to stick to the net stimulus protocol, but I'm just going to ensure that I'm managing it with a little bit more of nuance. So here are my key takeaways from the last 12 weeks on the net stimulus protocol. The protocol works very well, but only if you execute it precisely. Small mistakes in the set distribution and exercise selection can snowball over time and cause some tremendous fatigue issues. So just some small things like adding too many sets, doing too much volume on a certain movement pattern can really affect and limit your recovery abilities long term. Don't treat multi-joint exercises like isolation exercise. Big compound movements don't just hit one single muscle group. They hit several muscle groups, and that's something you need to account for. If you want to train hard, then I would recommend to reduce your goals, so you improve your focus and your ability to really progress long term, because the less you have to focus on, the easier it is to progress. No program is perfect. Always test, refine, and evolve. Your system is only as good as your ability to adapt to it. So that just means no program is perfect. The key is learning what worked well and what didn't, and what you can do better in the future. That's it for today's video. See you in the next one. And if you haven't done yet, please like, subscribe, and share this video, and turn on the notifications so you don't miss out on any new video. And if you're looking for coaching or training programs, then head to kingofweighted.com, buy your next program or book a free consulting call and start progressing like your future totally depends on it.